Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Center for American Progress. Thank you for coming out this morning. We will be getting started in just a couple of minutes. Two brief reminders before we begin. First, please silence all cell phones and other electronic devices. Second, there will be a question and answer period following the discussion. We ask that you wait for the microphone to come to you, state your name and affiliation before your question. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming here to the Center for American Progress. My name is Robert Schlesinger. I'm president of Schlesinger Communications and former managing editor for opinion at U.S. News and World Report. Before that, to consume the news in the United States these days, especially if you live here in Washington, is to hear a never-ending stream of stories involving corporate tax breaks and the drama surrounding them. Exempt us from this tax or we'll take our movie production elsewhere, or hotel, or big box store, or business. Or alternately, give us lots of money and we'll bring you, in exchange, we'll bring you lots of jobs and prosperity. Or pour billions of dollars into public funding of a new stadium, or the local sports team won't be the local sports team anymore. It'll be the local sports team somewhere else. It's a familiar story, but the details it's a familiar and pervasive story, but nevertheless the details are still shocking when you actually dig down and hear them. There's a tendency to, oh God, another team is asking for, another business is asking for, and then with something like the Billionaire Boondoggle, out now and available in the hallway, you read the details and you say, this is just absurd. So I'm delighted and honored to moderate an all-star panel discussing this phenomenon and what can be done about it. Going from your right on down. Benga Agilori is a senior economist at the Center for American Progress. His research focuses on race and local public finance, peer effects on adolescent behavior, and police militarization. Prior to joining CAP, he was an associate professor of economics at the University of Toledo. For those of you social media inclined, you can follow him on Twitter at GBENGA_AJILORE. Vanessa Williamson is a senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution. She studies the politics of redistribution with a focus on attitudes towards taxation. She's the author most recently of Read My Lips, Why Americans Are Proud to Pay Taxes, and previously co-author of The Tea Party and the Remaking of Republican Conservatism. Follow her on Twitter at V_WILLIAMSON, so V_last name. And finally, Pat Garofalo is managing editor for Talk Poverty at the Center for American Progress. He is the author of, again, The Billionaire Boondoggle, How Our Politicians Let Corporations and Bigwigs Steal Our Money and Jobs. Pat was previously assistant managing editor for opinion at U.S. News and World Report. And before that was economic policy editor at Think Progress here at in this building. You can follow Pat on Twitter at Pat_Garofalo, GAROFALO. I should note that Pat is not the Minnesota state legislator named Pat Garofalo, who's Pat without an _Garofalo on Twitter. I do, however, look forward to you finally being able to turn the tables on him, and like the official Raiders and the official Amazon Twitter accounts start sending him hate tweets. It's going to be awesome.
He's already complained about this once on Twitter, so the campaign is well underway.
So let's a good time. Let's say le bon temps roulé.
My day has finally come.
So let's start locally. Not too far from here, the Capital One Center is in a thriving neighborhood, which I'm old enough to remember when wasn't a thriving neighborhood. Nationals Park, which the Capital One Center is on its third or fourth corporate sponsor. Nationals Park, incredibly, is still on corporate sponsor 0. That neighborhood is there's a lot of stuff going on there, new restaurants, new buildings. No doubt the local politician, the local sports owner would say, look, here's an example of you build it and they will come. So what's wrong? Why is that not right?
So first, thanks everyone for coming. This is great. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces. So DC is actually a great example to start off with, because inevitably when people like me start complaining about sports stadiums and saying, hey, you probably don't have to give a guy who has billions of dollars and owns a Major League Baseball team a stadium on the public dime, people go, oh, well, look at DC. It totally worked. And the thing to note about DC is, first, Capital One Arena, not publicly financed. It was paid for by the owner of the Caps and the Wizards, so yay. Nats Park was publicly financed to the tune of $750 million. Yes, there's lots of stuff around Nats Park now. There's a brewery, there's a winery, there are chain coffee shops. But that's happening all over DC, right? Neighborhoods left and right are booming. Somehow, Mount Vernon Square turned into a booming neighborhood, no baseball stadium. Somehow, Columbia Heights turned into a booming neighborhood, no baseball stadium. So what you have to do is try and untangle the stadiums from the wider neighborhood effects and realize what's going on often isn't because of the stadium, but would have happened anyway.
Vanessa, can you give us some idea? What does the public? How does the public view these arenas? What is their view on? Is this a worthwhile expenditure of public money?
So when you're talking about corporate tax breaks in general and arenas in particular, what you'll find is that there's sort of two things to think about. There's one, do people like the idea, and there's two to people think about the idea, right? And so when it comes to corporate tax breaks overall, what we find is that anyone who ever remembers them dislikes them, but people don't think about it very often, right? So when I did one survey I did, ask people, what government spends money on, and they mentioned all the different kinds of things government spends money on. Less than 10% of people mentioned any corporate deal of any sort. Only a very small fraction of those were about arenas. But no one said anything good about it. Every single comment was negative, right, in an entire survey of several thousand people. So Americans, in general, oppose giving large tax breaks to already rich people, and that's actually, even among Republicans, most Republicans don't think corporations need tax breaks. They either think corporations' tax rates should stay the same or go up. And it's especially true for low-income Republicans, for that matter, and obviously Democrats feel that way as well. But it's not a salient issue, which makes it harder to organize people around, which is one of the problems, right? Like, broad-based public opinion is not what gets policy made, and especially when our politics is so nationalized, right? So that we're always thinking about what's happening across the entire country, and we're always thinking about what's happening here in Washington, right? But we're not always thinking about what's happening locally in Washington or locally anywhere else.
Benga, the next big, really big, publicly financed stadium is going to be out in Las Vegas, where the Oakland, then Los Angeles, then Oakland, and soon to be Las Vegas Raiders will be setting up shop. This is an example of another publicly funded stadium, but it's also one where they managed to take advantage of even another tax break beyond not simply what the locals are giving them, but they're getting some federal largesse too, right?
Right. So what you're talking about is that the new Las Vegas Raiders Stadium is going to be centrally located in an opportunity zone. Opportunity zones were part of the Tax Cut Act, where people firms get to, benefit from capital gains that they have. They park the money into some fund that goes into an opportunity zone, and then any money that they make from that goes tax-free. So you have this stadium that's right, and so the way they pick opportunity zones is they find a place that's called a distressed community. And so that's kind of, funny that you have, the Raiders are going to move to Vegas, build a stadium in a distressed community. And so they're going to benefit from that. So you have, not only is it publicly funded, but they're going to make even more money on top of that.
Vegas is actually a kind of wild example of what we're talking about here, because before the Raiders Stadium, which is going to get anywhere from $750 to $1 billion from Nevada taxpayers, a hockey arena was built for the Vegas Golden Knights, who people in this town should know made it to the Stanley Cup final last year.
What happened with that anyway?
I'm pretty sure they lost. Their arena was 100% built by the owner of the team, Bill Foley. So that guy did it right. He saw that, he thought for whatever reason that a hockey team would be popular in the desert. Lots of people doubted him. Turns out he was right. People go to these games. He built the arena and is going to reap the benefits. He sort of got ripped off, because then just a few months later, the wildest NFL team comes calling and gets nearly $1 billion. And so for some reason, Vegas decided that this thing that we didn't do before, we're going to go big on right now because it's the Raiders.
And there have been other instances too, right, where cities like Seattle.
So Seattle, it's one that, as an NBA fan, really always gets me upset. One of the things you mentioned before, when I taught at the University of Toledo, I taught an econ and sports class. And every time we got to the section on sports stadiums, I would always joke about getting on my soapbox and ranting. So be prepared for a rant. So Seattle, in the early 2000s, paid for the Seattle Mariners, the baseball team, their stadium in 2001, and then ponied up again for the Seattle Seahawks, the football team, their stadium. Now, the thing about the Seahawks, they're owned by the late Paul Allen, who was pretty rich, but they still funded over 90% of that stadium. So then the basketball team, the Sonics, came calling around 2004 saying, well, we need a new stadium. Now, this is the Sonics team at the time was owned by Howard Schultz. So that Howard Schultz. And so they asked for a new stadium, and the people of Seattle were like, you already took us for 2 stadiums. We're not going to do another one. So then Howard Schultz sold the Sonics to an ownership group that took the team away to Oklahoma City, who are now the Oklahoma City Thunder. So this is the problem with cities when people say, well, why do you keep funding these stadiums that actually go to the owners? It's like, if you don't fund it, they'll leave. And so we've seen this so many times, not just in Seattle, but in Cleveland. We've seen it in when LA didn't have a team for like 20 years, LA became the boogeyman for the NFL. They said, oh, build us a stadium or we'll move to LA. So Jacksonville, Minnesota, all these cities, ponied up for a public funded stadium because they knew a team could leave.
And this phenomenon of build a stadium and just as almost as construction is done, and that they're asking for another one. That's not new, right? I mean, this is something that you see.
Yeah, absolutely. But actually, the window for when stadiums are considered state of the art versus obsolete has shrunk in the last 50 years. Now teams start asking for new stadiums about 20 years after the old one, if not less time, which is a big problem because cities are often funding these things with 30-year bonds. So they're still they start paying for the new stadium while they're still paying for the old one. And in the Los Angeles example, St. Louis, who lost the Rams to Los Angeles, is still paying for the stadium that the Rams used to play in, even though it doesn't have a tenant.
So switching lanes a little bit, but staying local. Amazon is coming to the Northern Virginia area, the D.C. area. If my brother who lives in New York was here, he would go on a long rant of his own about all the jobs and prosperity that the activists drove out. Why should the residents of New York be happier than they, or residents in New York like my brother be happier than they are, and the residents of Northern Virginia be not so happy? Anyone?
All right, I'll start. Cool. Yeah, I'm with the activists on this one. Shock. What? No. Me and Jeff Bezos, we're just like this. For one thing, there's just something.
That's Pat with the underscore, if you're
right.
watching.
For one thing, there's just something kind of fundamentally wrong, right, about paying one of the richest companies on earth to do anything. Like, that just kind of at a fundamental level shouldn't be done. But this is a lot of money we're talking about, and it's not like New York doesn't have things it could do with that money. When you're talking about a state budget, most states have to constitutionally balance their budgets. So spending money on one thing quite literally means you can't spend it on something else. So this is just a ton of money that could have gone into building the sort of things that actually create long-term growth. Your education system, your infrastructure, social safety nets so workers have a high quality of life. Those are the sort of things you want to be competing on, instead of just dumping however many hundreds of $millions, in the case of Amazon, billions of dollars in New York onto this giant company.
And in either of these cases, do we yet know what exactly the deals they got were?
Sort of, but details do keep trickling out. We thought we knew what Amazon was getting in Northern Virginia, but then this week there was a report that they're going to get another, I think it was $70 million in a tech-related tax break that no one had noticed before, except for Amazon and the county board. So that's often the case with these things, is you actually don't know the full total cost until the end. Amazon is actually a really unique example because it was so high profile. There was this year-long circus that the company had us all engage in, where they collected data on hundreds of cities, narrowed it down to 20, did this whole song and dance. And so everyone was really paying attention. That's actually really unique in this area. Oftentimes this sort of stuff goes totally under the radar. Nobody's paying any attention at all. And so in many ways, Amazon sort of shot itself in the foot because everyone noticed this deal and saw that it was outrageously expensive and saw that there would be real downsides. Compare that to a story that came out, I think, last week or 2 weeks ago about Google, which has just been quietly going around the country, hoovering up about $1 billion in tax breaks, and no one paid any attention because they decided not to hold this giant public PR disaster.
I think on the when you're thinking about, I think it could cut either way. When you're thinking about the public attention, clearly Amazon got a lot of negative attention for this particular move, but it also reinforced the idea that this is the power that companies can have, right? And so it's sort of widely believed, for instance, that you can't raise taxes on rich people because they'll move away. The most comprehensive studies of this demonstrate that that is not the case. Millionaire tax flight is not really a thing. There's a slight tip of people moving from New York to Florida, but that's for a variety of reasons. But overall, millionaires don't really move. But people believe that, right? And so there's a thing that people commonly say as a reason why we can't raise taxes, we can't raise revenue, we just have to continue to starve our schools and that kind of thing. So I sort of worry that this goes both ways, right? That people are actually going to see the level of, power that these corporations are demonstrating in these towns against, public institutions.
I'm going to play devil's advocate here for a moment and talk about why people want to see business development. And so you think about Amazon, you think about the jobs that they bring, the people that they bring. And so you move to a location, people come in, they spend money, they put their kids in schools, they support the community. And so that would be a reason for wanting Amazon. But if that's the case, then you have to wonder why New York and D.C. New York and D.C. don't need that. You know, maybe Norfolk, Colorado, maybe Detroit, Michigan, maybe some other of these small towns. You know, they actually are going to Nashville too. But you think about towns that actually need that. You know, you think about these towns that lost jobs, or even think about Youngstown, Ohio, that just lost the GM Cruise. You know, that would be a place, if economic development, if the arguments are true, that would have gone into Amazon's calculus in terms of moving to these places. But instead, they went to New York and D.C., and these are places that are not lacking people coming.
Like to be the anti-devil
No,
advocate?
not at all.
Advocate?
That's something you see come up time and time again with these deals, is you end up paying companies to do things they would have done anyway. You know, Amazon looked at the entire country and they took this all very seriously, and they landed on the capital and the world capital of finance. So, you know, can we make an argument that they were intending to do that the entire time and this is just a windfall? Maybe. And also, it can't have been purely about the money, because if it was purely about the money, they would have gone to Newark, which offered them much more, or to Montgomery County, Maryland, which offered them much more. So there was something about being in D.C. and New York, pretty obviously, that is going to benefit this company. And that often gets left out of the equation, the stuff that draws a company to a place that has nothing to do with money. We talk about these deals as if the tax breaks are the be-all, end-all, and there's absolutely nothing else that places can compete on. It's money or nothing. And that's just not the case. There are reasons to be in a place like D.C. that have nothing to do with tax breaks.
But is there something to the argument, though, that, look, if you are, even if you're D.C. and New York and don't necessarily need it, but if you're Detroit, if you're a city that really could use an infusion of people coming in and investing in the community and spending money, and the companies spending money and bringing jobs, isn't that a plus?
Yes, it can be a plus in the short term, but the things you want cities competing on are the sorts of things I talked about earlier that are going to be for the longer term and for more people, right? The problem with these deals is it helps a tiny slice of the community, maybe, and a lot of that money ends up going to people who are already rich or are already executives, you know, and Amazon is going to fly in tech workers from other places. They're going to poach tech workers from other tech companies. So you're not really building anything long-term, sustainable, helping the sort of folks you need to help with economic development deals, and you're also causing a lot of pain. There was a study that came out a couple weeks ago that some 6,000 families will be pushed out of their neighborhood by Amazon coming to Crystal City because of the increase in housing costs. And so there's all sorts of that kind of stuff that goes on that you need to take into account, not just the headline, ooh, 25,000 jobs, that sounds good.
Vanessa, does it, do we have, is there any polling on Amazon? Do people like Amazon? I mean, everyone uses them, right, except for Pat. But I mean, is there polling on that? And does it make a difference in terms of how people view these sorts of deals?
So the polling really varies in how you ask the question. So, for instance, Amazon has very high levels of trust, while, for instance, Congress has very low levels of trust from the American people. But I think we're expecting different things of Congress and Amazon, whereas people are probably expressing that they trust Amazon to deliver a package, as opposed to trusting the United States Congress to make good laws, right? So I'm not entirely sure that the way that we ask these questions is really that meaningful. Overall, attitudes about corporations have gotten more negative. Now, attitudes about a lot of things have gotten more negative. It is worth pointing out. But, I mean, for instance, I was really struck, a poll question that I actually asked recently was whether people think that when a corporation profits, everyone benefits, or when a corporation profits, it comes at the expense of working people. And it was very narrowly divided, with 53% picking that corporations profit comes at the expense of working people, right? 53% to 47%. And to me, that was actually quite striking. I thought that the rhetoric of, what's good for GM sort of talk was really much more deeply embedded in how Americans think about these questions. So I think, and especially as public figures, one thing that's true is public opinion often trails elite opinion. So as public figures become more openly critical, and fights like what happened in New York happen, people update their opinions, right? And sort of take into account, they're like, oh, well, I think highly of these particular political figures, and so I'm going to, think through this issue in a way I hadn't before.
And it sets up a new permission structure for them to sort of alter their attitudes. Staying in politics for a moment, we found out this week that Milwaukee will be hosting the 2020 Democratic National Convention. what do they have to look forward to? And is this something that Milwaukeeans should be pleased about?
We get all the Democrats finally going to Wisconsin jokes out of the way now.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, let's just let's get it all out of our system. All right.
Hillary will be addressing it by remote. That's it. No more.
All right, we're cool. Everybody right. Great. So when I was writing the book, I had a really interesting discussion with a researcher who's looked into this very question, whether the DNC and RNC boost a city in the way that they're promised, because when cities are competing to get these events, you hear really outrageous economic impact estimations. We're going to see $300 million if the DNC comes here. We're going to see $400 million if the RNC comes here. And so this researcher went and looked at essentially hotel taxes and tried to figure out how much they went up in the city while it was hosting the convention and extrapolate from there how much more spending would have to occur in order to get to that $400 million. And the number is totally outrageous. If you're just going off of that, people would have to be renting their hotels and spending $2,000 a night in the bar to get to that 300, 400 million estimate. So it's not that there's no benefit. It's good to have people there, but it's much, much smaller than all the boosters say. It's going to be tens of millions, not hundreds of millions. And the reason why that happens, makes sense, is you have a sort of hassle effect. Yes, the convention draws people in, but it also scares people away. So say the convention were to come here, all of us would know not to go anywhere near the arena that night, whereas otherwise we might have been there. We might have gone to a Caps game. We might have gone to a restaurant or bar, but like, oh no, we're staying home. Traffic's going to be terrible. And so some of the gain of having new people there is offset by the loss of local spending that would have occurred anyway.
And also in the situation of a political convention, you can't get near the arena oftentimes. Unless you've got the special credential, you're not going to get within a half a mile of wherever it is.
I mean, when I was at US News working for that guy, I got to go to the DNC in Philadelphia in 2016, and once you got into the arena, you realized how much of a joke it was that there was going to be any economic boost from it, because once you were in, there was no way I was going to leave again to go to a bar or a restaurant. It would have taken me 2 hours to get out and get back in.
If it was a Trump hotel, though, it would be then it really would be easy to spend $300 million, right?
Also that.
Do we know if public opinion-wise people view and get tax breaks to get an event as different from tax breaks for bringing a corporation or keep a corporation, what have you?
I don't actually think there's enough work on this question, and it's so important to local economies that it would be so helpful if we did know more. But almost all there's strong biases in what we know about taxes. There's a ton of work on the income tax. It cares very much about that because it's such a partisan issue. There's much less work on almost like sales tax, payroll tax, any other kind of tax, certainly. And there's also a tendency to focus on national taxes because those polls are done at the national rates, right? So if you want to know about these things, you'd have to be doing really high quality local polling for most of these issues. So I think there's an enormous gap in what we know about it. I think we would probably find so why are local politicians doing this? Partly maybe there's a secondary story. Partly they would like the love that the local sports team has to fund them. That must be part of the calculation, right? So I think it would actually be a really valuable thing to do that kind of work to see whether that political calculation is merited. Easily not be.
I think one of the things when we talk about getting sports teams, building stadiums, or getting conventions, a lot of it is, this kind of goes into, I think, talking about the Olympics, getting the Olympics. Are you an caliber city? Are you a city that's worthwhile to get a DNC, a convention, or RNC? Are you worthwhile to have a team? And a lot of people's brand. It's about that team. Like you ask any Cleveland fan about LeBron James, and he's a god, right? Because he brought a championship to a city that hadn't seen one practically ever. And so that kind of, but the question is, how do you quantify that goodwill? How do you quantify those benefits? And so, I'd been to Toledo, and so Toledo's not a major league kind of city because it's we have the Mud Hens, which is AAA, but it's almost like a ceiling on how good your city is, as opposed to Cleveland Indians, the Detroit Tigers, that kind of city, and so that's kind of goes into it. So then when the Browns left in, I think it was late '98 or '97 to go to Baltimore, that was a big hit for the city of Cleveland, and so they did everything in their power to bring back the Browns because that's kind of their identity.
And it was bizarre this week watching, after the announcement of Milwaukee, Miami started going negative on Milwaukee. It was like, what's going on? It's a convention. Everyone calm down a little bit.
One other thing to add to the convention talk is that it's not just these like high-profile DNC RNCs. Cities do go all out to get these conventions, and there's been a huge explosion of public convention center building over the last 30 to 40 years. And much like gambling, which we can talk about at some point, since all the cities were trying the same thing, the pot of available conventions just stayed the same, and so everyone was fighting over this already existing pot of conventions. There are only so many of these big events that can happen in any given year. And so cities poured all this money into building these centers and then realized they had to go and steal conventions from other cities in order to make this pay off. And that's a problem with all of these deals. Like when a job moves from California to Texas or from Mississippi to Florida, yeah, maybe it's the second state's gain, but it's the first state's loss. And we are all like one country, right? And so I think there's something not super noble about basing your city's economic development on yoinking stuff from all of the cities and states around you.
And there is an extent, isn't there, to which if there was, if you could limit the number of conventions, are there 5 convention centers in the country, then actually it might make sense to invest in that because, okay, that's going to bring money in from out of town. But if there are 500 convention centers in the country, you don't know if you're going to get the business, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the same thing has happened with gambling, where when you could only gamble in Atlantic City and Las Vegas, it was a huge deal, and people went way out of their way to go to those places. But now we have some 40-something states with casino gambling, and so now it's not about drawing people in. It's about quite literally keeping your residents in your state to gamble because you don't want them to cross the state line and drive 2 hours to gamble somewhere else. It's the same thing with convention centers, where everybody's now just desperate to keep what they have, and they're doubling and tripling and quadrupling down on that just because they don't want it to leave.
This nicely segues to another concept. You talk about it in the Billionaire Boondoggle, this sort of destination tourist retail. One of the things that I just found so bizarre in the book was that there's a sporting goods store in a giant pyramid in Memphis. What in the name of Elvis's mausoleum is going on?
Yeah, this is everybody's favorite thing from the book. Everyone's favorite topic is the Memphis Pyramid. So yeah, if you go to Memphis and you walk down to the Mississippi River, there on the shores is a giant black pyramid with a giant Bass Pro Shops in it. And you go inside the Bass Pro Shop, and there are literally rivers in the floor with fish and either alligators or crocodiles. I always goof this up. Critters running around. There are video games you can play. You can buy coffee. There's a bowling alley. It's a whole thing. So Memphis decided to build a pyramid because, get it, it's like Memphis, Egypt. And so there's this long plan to build a pyramid in Memphis. And it has been it was basically a flop from the beginning. First, it was going to be like a concert venue, and nobody went to that. It was a basketball arena for a very short while, and then they opened up the FedEx Forum down the street, so the basketball team just moved across town. So the city paid a ton of money to have Bass Pro Shops come in and fill this thing after it literally stayed empty for, I want to say, 15 years. It might have been 10. And Bass Pro is actually really good at doing this. They convince not just cities like Memphis, but tiny towns all over America that their stores are going to be a destination site. And so they've gotten some $1 billion in tax breaks in recent decades to build these gigantic sporting goods stores.
So, having lived in Toledo for 15 years, we had a Cabela's nearby. And that actually was a tourist destination. Like, people actually make plans to go out there, shop, but there was probably about 3 or 4 hotels built around it. I forgot the name of the town, but it's like a small town about 20 miles north of Toledo in Michigan, where people actually made trips. And then there was a big Bass Pro Shops that opened in Toledo. Again, another destination, hotels built around it. So, not to defend it, because you really shouldn't. I mean, if it's that profitable, states and cities shouldn't be ponying up for it. And so that's what we need to really focus on, is that, yeah, it's profitable, it is a tourist destination, but cities don't need to fund it.
Vanessa, does that argument ever seep through? Do people get that, hey, if this is going to be such a big success, why do we need to subsidize it?
First of all, I just want to say that most of these ideas seem bad on their face to me, but building a pyramid in Memphis is amazing, and I'm really into it, and I would have made that mistake. Okay, I had to get that off my chest. So I think there's a real challenge more broadly that if you were going to ask, like, what's the Republican vision of how the economy works, it's very straightforward and clear, right? You do tax breaks and less regulation, and job creators create jobs, right? And that's what happens, and it's the people who are already rich who are responsible for the economy, right? And are the sort of valuable actors in the economy. And if I ask, okay, so what's the other vision? It's very, like, there's a lot of good data on this. Like, it's even people who are very progressive in their political views have a very hard time describing how the economy works without resorting to those tropes, right? And I think that underlies a lot of these questions, right? So there's not the sense that, like, our city's valuable. We have, like, the people who work here and shop here are valued, and therefore this company would like to open here. And it is a favor to them that we, like, allow them to come here and instead of a different sporting goods company. But I think that a narrative of the economy that is different from the we must reward the job creators, all 7 of them, it basically doesn't really exist, right? And you can see that in survey data, you can see that in long-form interviews, that there's just not a coherent idea of what makes growth happen, what makes people have jobs, what makes jobs appear. All that is just kind of lacking.
That's a problem with, I think, these deals across the board, is that the story feels right. We'll give Amazon some money, and they'll come here, and they'll create all these jobs, and everything will be great for everyone. Like, that's easy to explain, and it kind of, like, in your gut feels good. And then, people like me come rolling along and be like, read these 277 pages about why that's not true, There's a substitution effect. Womp, womp, womp. We start sounding like the teacher in Peanuts. So that's why I actually found the Amazon and New York thing sort of encouraging, because it was one of very few high-profile examples where the opposing case actually sounded pretty good, too.
Very quickly explain the substitution effect.
It's basically what I was talking about before, wherein spending gets replaced by other spending. So a person who doesn't go downtown to hang out at the bar because they know that it's going to be like a zoo because of a giant event, the new person who came to that area is just replacing the person who didn't come to the area.
Or if I'm going to the Nats game and spending money there, it's not that I wasn't going to spend money anyway. That's money I'm not spending at a local restaurant or whatever.
Right, and that's the thing with these, and that one of the crazy making points is we brought a football team here, and look, the bars and restaurants are packed, as if everyone in the city, when there was no football team, was just sitting at home, sad, streaming on Netflix, being like, I really, really wish we had a football stadium I could go to. If only that could happen. No, people don't do that. That's not how people work.
I want to touch on something that Vanessa mentioned earlier about this concept of why do politicians do this? Because there was some really interesting data, I think, that you mentioned. I hope you can expand on it, on public support for politicians who appear to be making it, show, look, I'm trying to rain tax breaks on these companies to get them to bring jobs, versus politicians who don't show that and the jobs come anyway. Either of you want to?
Yeah, some of the more discouraging research that I came upon while writing the book was that these deals do move votes, particularly in small town local elections. It's just empirically shown that the lawmakers who engage in this sort of stuff and try to get deals, they don't even have to be successful. Just the effort means that their vote share does go up. Elected city mayors engage in far more of this than unelected city managers. So there is certainly a political effect, particularly at the local level, of doing this. So even if the politician sort of knows, like, I've read the studies and I've seen what happens and this probably isn't great, but I would really like to win that next election, so I'm going to go out and try and sell, company X on coming here. And I'm not quite sure what we do about that other than having events like this.
But what I'm hearing from you is that they should try but fail. That is the successful political strategy, right? Appear to have tried to convince companies to come. Do not get them to come. Maintain your tax base.
We will offer you just a little bit less than that $10. Oh, you don't want to come here? Nuts. Darn. Aw.
Vote for me. I'm an incompetent salesman.
It actually makes me think about the Olympics and how there was this kind of arms race where you always try to get the Olympics and you build stadiums and you put things together and infrastructure, and even to the point of corruption, where we think about Qatar and Russia, that there was a lot of corruption that came about paying the IOC to actually get it, and so there's kind of been a sea change more recently in terms of trying to get it. So that when you talked about how do we get people not to do it, when Boston and Chicago said, "Hey, we're going to try for the Olympics," everybody that I knew in that city was freaking out. They're like, "No, we don't want it at all." Even Boston was like, every August when school starts, we can't handle it, and we're going to have an Olympics at the same time. And then talking about your St. Louis example, I think about Montreal that got the Olympics in 1976, built Olympic Stadium, and then and then that was a 30-year bond. And they were like, oh, well, after the Olympics, we have the Montreal Expos, and they're going to play in there. Now, for those of you the Montreal Expos no longer exist. They're now the Washington Nationals. And they left, and they left, I think it was probably 2002 maybe a little earlier. Montreal was still paying, and they finally paid it off in 2006. So the payment lasted longer than the team did. And so, but now we see with the Olympics that, cities are, some cities are being more careful about what to do and what they are promising, and some cities are like, we just can't do it.
And this then puts the cities in a more powerful situation, right?
Yeah, the one Olympics that everyone points to as being this huge financial success is the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles. And the reason that worked out is because after the debacle in Montreal, no one wanted these Olympics. They all looked at Montreal and went, nope, you know what, we don't want a part of this. My favorite factoid from those Montreal Olympics is that the stadium is a big circle, and the name of it was going to be the big O, the capital letter, and the residents all changed it to O-O-W-E. And so Los Angeles was able to say to the International Olympic Committee, we're going to do this on the cheap, and really crucially, we are not going to take the provision in the contract that every other city takes that says we, the city, are responsible for any cost overruns. Fun fact, the city is responsible for any costs that go over budget when the Olympics come, and the Olympics go over budget literally 100% of the time. Every single one has gone over its budget, and the city winds up being responsible for all of that, except for in this case when Los Angeles said, nope, we're not going to do it, and if you want to have an Olympics, you're going to do it our way. And I mean, that's what we ultimately want to be the case everywhere, right? There's a prisoner's dilemma at work here, where in cities and states, unless they all get together and say, we're not going to do this, one can always say, all right, we'll do it.
Well, it's the Bryce Harper effect, where you just find one dumb owner. But, there have been cases, though, right, where states will form compacts and cities will form compacts. We're not gonna be suckers. We're not gonna. And then, how do those turn out?
Yeah, they don't really last. In the wake of Amazon, there's been a kind of renewed interest in this, and a few states getting together and saying, "Hey, we'll all pledge not to do this to each other." Right? All it takes is one new governor or one new, state house to flip, and the cycle starts all over again. And at this point, it's being egged on oftentimes at the national level. So I don't put a lot of faith, honestly, in those multi-state things. I just think you end up kind of constantly trying to shove holes in the dam with every election.
And speaking of the national level, we just passed a big tax reform that will clean up the tax code. That's what it did, right? It cleaned up the tax code and make everything simpler. What did this have any
I filled out my
effect
taxes on a postcard the other day.
Yeah, exactly.
As promised.
But what is this? How did this play into these issues? Were there provisions on dealing with these sorts of things? I mean, you talked about the enterprise zones, the opportunity zones. Anyone?
I think it played into this in the sense that that law also bought into the big lie around these things, right? That the best way to create jobs and boost your economy and build sustainable growth is by raining a lot of money on corporations. And so that bill, by just slicing the corporate tax rate down, followed along the same sort of theoretical, logical lines. If we just give this company a bunch of money, it'll be really nice and hire a bunch of people and everything will be grand for everyone.
But on the upside, that bill was not popular, right?
Yeah, and it was incredibly unpopular among Democrats. You will not be at all surprised to know that anything you talk to Democrats about involving the Republican Congress and Trump was exceedingly unpopular, including this. And also Democrats hold very strong views on progressivity. It wasn't that popular among Republicans. And that was a remarkable failure of Republican elites, right? Because Republican partisanship is extremely strong, right? So typically, when partisanship is strong, what that means is political scientists expect that when elites start saying, hey, this is one of the things about being a Republican, or Democrat for that matter, partisans get in line, right? They're like, I'm updating my views. I understand now that this is, I know more about a particular issue, right? And I mean, this happens at all levels of education. This is not like low information voters, but it's actually especially high information voters because they hear the party line faster. So yeah, no, it's not necessarily the best news for democracy, but it is true. But the interesting thing was, one, Republicans did not work very hard to make the bill appealing to their base, in terms of, for instance, like sending everyone a check, like the Bush administration had done, where they passed a big tax cut. Two, they didn't get a lot of mobilized support. So when the TCJA, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, as it was known, was passing through Congress, exactly 2% of the public thought that taxation was the most important issue for the country to be dealing with. 2%. Right? So this was, it was a sort of remarkable failure to get their base on board. And then you see this data, like at the same time when a huge tax cut is going to corporations, most Republican voters say that taxes on corporations should either go up or stay the same. So there was a real disconnect between what the party was doing at a national level and what most of the base would actually have said they wanted to have happen.
So what are the things that we can do as citizens, as go home, tell your friends? What are the lessons to be drawn from these experiences?
Well, read the book.
Yeah.
Aw,
The Billionaire
thanks.
Boondoggle, on sale in the back.
Well, because, I'm very much into the sports stadiums, talking about the Olympics, and we hear about Amazon. And what's kind of, what's been so nice about this book coming out now is that it ties, it's one thing I was telling Pat earlier, is that this book, unfortunately, is always going to be timely. There was always, this book was supposed to come out a month from now around tax day. It was, pushed up a bit, and it just fits right into the Amazon story. There's always going to be some stadium. There's always going to be, one of the things we didn't talk about was Foxconn in Wisconsin. Oh, yeah. I mean, that was...
Give a little bit of the background there in case...
So this was in Wisconsin, and the previous governor, Scott Walker, had provided billions probably to Foxconn to bring a plant into, I want to say, Racine, Wisconsin, or Kenosha, Wisconsin, and it was going to bring all these jobs in, and it was going to really revitalize the area. And then when Foxconn came in, then all of a sudden the story started to change. They said, oh, well, the kind of jobs that we need are not going to be for people with different skills. Like, well, we need to import a lot of engineers. And so then the number in terms of like the benefit kept going down and down and down. And so that's another story of, he touted it, when it's actually like, I brought in Foxconn, I did all these great things. And when the actual reality comes, it's not happening. And so, one, we need to hear more stories about that, tell more stories about that. So we think about with Olympics, 20 years ago, every city was fighting for Olympics. Now every city is fighting not to get the Olympics. But that's a lot of the, the narratives, the stories that we keep telling is like, this is not going to work. This is the reason why it's not going to work. You look at the Amazon story, talk about, one of the things that happened was that you look at New York City, Long Island City, and then National Landing were the places. And then you look at a map of opportunity zones, you're like, oh, wow, these are right next to opportunity zones. How did that happen? And so, again, telling these stories, getting the narrative out that this actually doesn't benefit, and there are other things that we can do.
Foxconn was obviously got a lot of publicity. How often does the bad ending to the not happy ending to the story actually trickle down and penetrate to people?
Yeah, this actually is, you were asking what I think people can do, and one of the things that I think is most important is, in addition to buying the book, obviously, first job. Second job, investing in local news coverage, because that's actually the only way people are going to find out, right? These things are not, like, once they, get their new stadium, they're all very proud of it, but, like, how much money did they throw away to do it? That part is not nearly as obvious without, like, literally years of research to, like, put all the data together, right? So I think that that is actually one of the really crucial missing pieces when we're thinking about getting public opinion to move on this question. It's making sure that people have access to the data they would need to be able to assess the decisions their politicians are making. And in most huge swaths of the country, they don't have access to that information.
Pat, bring us home.
Yeah, I mean, oftentimes it takes a disaster, right? It takes a Montreal to have the Olympics go the way they did, and what happened in Russia with the crazy amount of money they spent. It takes Amazon, which has this certain reputation for its effect on Seattle, and people noticing that. It just takes these bad instances. So I guess the more that we can highlight the negative effect that these deals have had, the more we can be moderately optimistic that someday we'll stop them.
So the next book will be called "It Takes a Bankrupt Village."
And I got to write that down.
Any other thoughts before we go to now? The best part of these events is always actually not what we think is interesting, but what all of you think is interesting. So I think Adam is going to be walking around with the microphone. Do people have questions right here in the front?
And just an additional...
I apologize. I should say, please identify yourself and identify your affiliation if you have one.
June O'Connell. I'm originally from Wisconsin. I would just like to comment on Foxconn that one of the more appalling aspects of it was that this was a Republican governor in a Republican state house that was reducing budget cuts to mental health and then offering zillions of dollars to Foxconn. So those were happening at the same time. But the question I have for you all is that in the 70s, I was a labor lawyer in the South, and auto companies from Europe and Japan built auto plants, and various cities in North Carolina or South Carolina bid on them because they could go anywhere in the South. All of the South was anti-union. So that part was accomplished. So they were looking for the best bids. And I think if you went to some of those towns today, it would be interesting, but I think they would think they benefited from getting Honda and Nissan and whatever. So my question is, over time, doesn't some of the bidders win?
I think it's certainly possible on occasion. But the question actually goes to what you talked about with Foxconn. What are you not paying for when you do pay for this, right? What money doesn't go into your healthcare system? What money doesn't go into your schools? What money doesn't go into your roads and infrastructure because you end up giving it to Toyota? So I'd be certainly interested to see what the price tag was for those things and what ended up going unfunded because of them.
You said that those cities in the South would say they won, but then who lost? They would say they won, but at what cost? And we talk about with the convention centers that you're basically stealing jobs from other places. So on net, is there a real benefit that all those places up in Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio that lost it to Tennessee, North Carolina? Are we really winning? Is that what we want to do?
I think there's also, I hadn't thought about this before, that one of the impacts could be a sort of downward spiral, where because you've invested in tax breaks for one particular company, you've had to make a choice not to invest in something else, which would then make your city look less appealing, right? If the schools aren't as good, a national company might not want to bring their workers there, right? So you could imagine it actually it makes you increasingly reliant on those bids. It makes you increasingly reliant on one or two corporate saviors as opposed to having a robust local economy.
That's actually something we see a lot with subsidizing movie and TV production. Those things are extremely transient and can move around. And so the states that went big on those things just need to keep spending more and more and more and more to keep the same level of activity, because those are things that are really easy to sort of pick up and move. And it happened just down the highway in Baltimore, which paid a lot of money to have House of Cards and Veep filmed there. And then California came along and offered more money to Veep, and then it was gone. And so you get into this competitive economic purgatory where you just have to keep paying more and more and more and getting held up for ransom every year.
You'd think that investing in something called House of Cards, like on its face, that would be a big red flag. In the back. And don't forget
James Sang. We've talked about stadiums. And
I apologize. Name and affiliation. Don't forget,
James
please.
Sang, retired.
Sorry.
A New Yorker originally. We've talked about stadiums and sports centers. What about some slightly different kind of development where a city puts money in? Cornell Tech. It's $100 million of New York money and some awfully valuable land on Roosevelt Island. How does that... And then the other side of oddball things, although it's another country, if you go to Japan, the Shinkansen stations are all tremendous, the biggest shopping centers you've ever seen. And of course that has something to do with the fact that JR doesn't have to follow anybody's zoning rules, but it is a form of subsidized development. Any comments?
And I'm not familiar with the Cornell example, but you can find all sorts of stuff that cities have invested in. If you want to talk about a city owning a hotel or a city investing in a data center, there's all sorts of under the radar stuff that goes on in this area. We picked on a few of the sort of big highlight headline deals, but this happens in cities and states every day, all the time. And honestly, most of the time we don't find out about it. There was an audit done that came out a few weeks ago in New Jersey, which has spent really, really big on corporate tax incentives for years. Chris Christie was really into them. And it turned out that the programs had just been chugging along, and literally no one had gone back to look and see what sort of job creation numbers there were. They pulled up the spreadsheets, and there were 3,000 jobs that were on one piece of paper and not on another, and no one could reconcile them. And that happens with these programs all the time. The lack of transparency is really, really high.
But you mentioned, Pat, cities owning hotels. Why would a city own a hotel?
That is a fantastic question. Usually, it's actually connected to the convention center discussion. Usually what happens is a city will build a convention center, and then when no conventions come, they'll say, you know what we need next is a hotel. And then when no private developer will come in, they will literally build and own the hotel themselves. The Baltimore Hilton is a great example, where the city paid to have it constructed, some $350 million, and for quite literally 10 years it didn't turn a profit. So this thing has just been sitting on the city books for a decade, doing nothing. And when you're standing there in front of it, you can see what an absurd idea it was, because there are 3 other hotels right in the immediate vicinity. So the publicly owned hotel is stealing visitors from those are stealing from the publicly owned hotel, and it's a big mess. Lots of cities have done this. There's some $8 billion in taxpayer money have gone to about 120 hotels in the U.S., and some 30% of those were entirely financed by the public.
Let's see, on the left there.
Hi, my name is Lorca Millen. I'm with Global Witness. We investigate corruption in oil, gas, and mining sectors. And I just want to point out that we do see these types of, I guess you could call it boondoggles in that sector as well, in places like Louisiana. And to me, that's very puzzling, even more puzzling than the examples you've been giving, because, it's not about competing with other states or attracting jobs, events, TV shows or consumer traffic, whatever. Oil is in the ground in a certain place or under an ocean. It's in Louisiana. It's not in Connecticut. So that's a puzzle, and I wonder if you have seen examples of that in your book. I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I look forward to it. To me, what those examples suggest that is that this is not. It's not necessarily just boondoggles, but it's, if you take that element of competition off the table, it indicates a degree of corporate capture, if not in some cases even outright corruption. I guess those are 2 related but different questions, whether you've seen examples of these kinds of tax breaks for in the natural resources sector, and then relatedly, how big of an element do you think there is of corporate capture? Thank you.
Yeah, so that's certainly tax breaks for oil and gas companies are kind of a huge, perennial political issue. I didn't get much into them in the book, but they are certainly there. On the corruption point, one of the more fun/depressing studies that I saw while researching the book is that there is actually a correlation between a state giving out more corporate tax incentives and lawmakers winding up in prison on corruption charges. So you can draw a line between the 2, which makes sense, right? Because these breaks are often, if not industry specific, literally firm specific. Like, not just we're going to give them to manufacturing companies, we're going to give them to Foxconn. So it inevitably breeds a sort of coziness between the corporations and the state. On Louisiana specifically, yes, it's absurd to be subsidizing Louisiana oil companies to do their thing, because that's a hugely profitable industry. But there was actually a really encouraging story a month or 2 ago, wherein because of the John Bell Edwards in Louisiana, he changed the way that corporate tax breaks work in Louisiana to require local government bodies to approve them as well as the state level. And so the tax breaks Exxon came up, and a local school board was actually able to knock them down because the local teachers threatened to go on strike if the tax breaks were approved. It was actually a super encouraging story, and I think gets into what we're trying to say, which is if we just let people know about these things, there is a certain innate level of outrage that will come out. And in that instance, the teachers were actually able to mobilize opposition enough that the tax breaks were struck off the books.
But this also gets to the overall sort of through line that we've talked about already, right? Where the idea is, well, we need to give tax breaks to encourage business, and you can sort of, once you accept that frame, you can kind of lead the question of, if oil isn't going anywhere and the company can't go anywhere and the company is hugely profitable, why do we need to support them, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. But I think that there is, and in part probably, I would guess, because of some of these prominent examples of companies, especially sports teams, moving, it can feel like that the position of power is the company's position, right? That basically the economy is being upheld by a series of bribes to the 4 companies that actually employ anyone. And I think that and I think that probably plays into a lot of the sort of monopolistic tendencies of our economy recently. But convincing people that that your community is good enough, that people would want to open a business there just because, without any other motivations, right? It's sort of a sad thing that people don't intrinsically feel that confidence, or the confidence you were talking about with the teachers, that like we can actually get by without this. Yeah.
Here in the jacket. Don't forget name and affiliation.
Hi, Paul White. I'm here on my own. So about things one could do about this. Talked about tax bill, and we need to fix the tax bill one of these days. What if the profit, the money that was being given to a corporation was counted as fully taxable and calculated in some way to impute its full value? And while we're at it, maybe not allowing tax exempt bonds for these practices.
And wasn't that actually the issue of tax exempt bonds? Wasn't that something that was in the tax bill and then, well, you tell the story.
So specifically for sports stadiums, there was a provision to reduce the tax exempt status on sports stadiums, and depends on who you talk to, but it seems like the president snuck in at the last minute and made sure that thing got taken out. On the question of making these things taxable, absolutely. I mean, the really easy, elegant solution to this is to just have Congress come in and kind of Godzilla stomp and say, no, all of this money is considered taxable income, taxed at a rate of 150%, and you would knock this off overnight, right? Not a lot of faith that that's going to happen, but that is the super easy, elegant solution to this if Congress ever found the will to do it.
By the way, Pat, if you're trying to argue that you're not trying to hollow out cities and destroy them, maybe don't associate yourself with Godzilla. Other questions? Here in the second row.
Jason, private citizen. I'm just wondering, do you see, or what do you think is the impact of Ocasio-Cortez standing against the leaders of New York City in the Amazon deal?
I'm glad we covered this, because there's actually a rule in Washington now that you can't have an event without mentioning Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
I think it gets at what we've been talking about, in that because this was such a high-profile, circus event, and Amazon drew it out for so long, there was a political moment where someone could step up and say, hey, here's the downsides. We're not going to do that. And Ocasio-Cortez, along with a bunch of local lawmakers and activists, is very much a team effort, seized it and stepped in and saw the moment. And honestly, that's how we're going to stop at least some percentage of these things, is by having people willing to step up and do that.
I think one of the other things to kind of go along with that is that people heard about what they were giving away. And so one of the biggest concerns about that whole Amazon process is that depending on the city and depending on their laws, they didn't have to release it. I think it was Denver had, because it was like a private company doing it, they didn't have to release it. Other cities said, okay, this is what we offered. But if we had a more transparent process, and so you see, oh, this is how much you're giving away, then people are going to, be, more aware of it. There's going to be more outrage. Or cities might say, okay, this is what we've offered. This is why we've offered it. And the city might say, oh, citizens might say, okay, I see what you're doing. But the fact that it was so, non-transparent, and for a company like Amazon and Jeff Bezos being so prominent and understanding how much, even like last year, I think it was both Apple and Amazon hit the $1 trillion in valuation, and that made news. And so you say, okay, wait, you're worth $1 trillion, yet we're giving away the farm for this. So that is the kind of thing to kind of shift the narrative.
And the blue. Oh yeah, please.
I mean, I think this is actually one. So most people know relatively little about tax law. I'll be short. I'll be super short. Most people know very little about how tax law works. But one thing that does stick in the public mind, and is sort of you see relatively commonly both in surveys and interviews, is people saying, I can name a company that paid less in taxes than I did. Now, whether they name it correctly is not always true, right? Often it's just a company they don't like. But there's a strong sense out there that there are large, extremely profitable corporations that are paying less than, well, they're paying nothing, so they're paying less than anyone who pays taxes.
And now, the familiar face in the blue jacket.
Gabby Levy, former U.S. News colleague of Rob and Pat, now at Climate Nexus. You mentioned Google. What's the next one of these that we should be looking out for and raising hell about?
I don't know. I feel like the Amazon thing is probably going to scare them away for a little bit. So I don't think there's going to be another like giant one like right at this moment. They're going to wait for the political climate to get a little bit better. But if you are from California, I would watch out because there's been some news about an Oakland A's stadium. So keep an eye out.
But I mean, you mentioned Google. You mentioned that they didn't do the sort of big LeBron-style Amazon the decision.
I'm taking my talents to Northern Virginia.
Yes. They just go sub rosa. Might it be that it's not that companies aren't going to go for the big deal? They're just going to follow the Google model, not the Amazon model?
Yeah, that's probably right. They're going to learn their lesson and try and keep it out of the headlines.
Thank you. I'm a researcher at CAP, but also an organizer in Northern Virginia. And I was really struck, Pat, by what you mentioned about the political incentives for politicians to be seeking out these giant deals, even though they know that it's going to be a problem for them. And in the case of Amazon coming to Northern Virginia, one of the concerns that organizers have long had, especially in Arlington County, is how this will accelerate both gentrification and displacement, and also really fundamentally alter the political landscape that we're organizing in, and what the population of Arlington County will look like, and what the long-term ramifications therefore will be. And so I was wondering if you could speak to that, both in the case of Amazon, but also more broadly, what does it mean for that displacement to be accelerated and for the political landscape to transform?
Yeah, like I said, that was one of the more discouraging aspects of this whole thing was realizing that the press releases and the ribbon cutting and the front page paper on the local whatever Post Gazette is really worth something to the politicians, and that does help them get reelected. On the flip side, there are some high-profile examples where it didn't work. The one I'm thinking of is in 2016, the Anaheim City Council flipped because the city had been giving hundreds of millions of dollars to Disney. And finally, the people in the city had said, all right, enough, and elected, it was called the People's Council, actually, to close the spigot. It's not like a very satisfying answer, but like you just got to convince the people in office that that's what's going to happen to them if they keep pushing these deals through, and that the incentive actually isn't for them, and that the front page, the picture on the front page of the paper is going to be not worth it.
Also on gentrification, though, how do you find the balance where presumably you want to bring prosperity to neighborhoods, but you don't want to do it in a way where you're simply pushing the neighborhood out and sort of replacing it with a new neighborhood? How do you work that balance?
Well, I think the easiest way is just to start with the existing residents, because you want them to benefit, not the area. Because we see in a lot of places the area benefits, but the people who are there are gone. So if you start by going to the existing residents, seeing what sort of services that they need, whether it's grocery stores or whether it's a community center or whether it's just, new housing, you just start with the existing residents and then go from there.
Novel concept, actually talking to the talking to the locals. Other questions? I feel like I'm teaching grade school. All of a sudden, everyone's too cool to actually raise their hand. Oh, there we are.
Hi, Kate Gallagher-Robbins with Center for American Progress. In the news lately, obviously, has been H.R. 1, which is the big democracy bill that just got passed in the House. I'm wondering if you guys can talk a little bit, thinking about the politicians and these sort of front page opportunities that they're having, how you think this connects to some of the democracy reforms that we're seeing right now, and if there's sort of hope to be found in that nexus?
I have so many thoughts on this subject. It is almost impossible for me to organize my thoughts. So yeah, I think that when we talk about tax policy, we should be thinking of it as democratic reform. I think that that's the right way to talk about why it's important to raise taxes on wealthy people, because wealthy people distort our democracy, right? It's much more important than the revenue.
So small d democratic reform, not big d democratic reform.
I think it would both, wouldn't it?
I'm
joking. It was a joke. I don't know. No, but I think that when we're talking about taxation, this is about making our democracy stronger. And these things have been linked for literally hundreds of years, right? One of the things that frightens wealthy people about democracy through history is the idea that someone might tax them. That's like the big problem, right? So I think that this is exactly right. Also, particularly on taxation and democracy, one thing I'm working on is giving people the opportunity to register to vote when they file their income taxes. So, I think there's actually a lot of work to be done on this. Yeah.
But isn't this attempt to get more people to vote just a big power grab by Democrats?
Didn't realize Mitch McConnell was here in a Darth Vader tie today.
I just channel him sometimes. I don't know. Other questions? Going once? Right here on the side. That's a very productive row right there.
Valerie Novak. I'm a fellow at CAP, I guess. So how does all of this, a lot of this is talking about economic development specific to like a locality. Do you talk about, or how does this fit into, since we're talking about the democratic process, like campaign and kind of buying favor through campaign donations, I guess?
I mean, like I said before, it's certainly the case that these things breed a sort of closeness between the corporations and the lawmakers they're working for, and you can sort of see, like Vanessa was saying before, if a town becomes dependent on one company and kind of turns into a company town, how that would breed a level of corruption and connectivity between the people who are running the business and the people who are making the local decisions, and how this stuff would just sort of snowball. And suddenly it's not just property tax breaks for the company. It's, well, we'll build the road for you to your plant. It's, well, we'll build a park across the street so that your workers can have somewhere to hang out. You get into that sort of stuff and you end up expending a huge amount of public resources. And actually was the case, the example I used before with Anaheim and Disney, where I'm not going to get the number exactly right, but it's something like a third of the city budget was being spent on subsidies for Disney because they had become just so dependent, and because Disney gave huge campaign donations to the members of the city council, and it just turned into this snowball effect.
And Pat, you mentioned that the correlation between corruption and these sort of tax breaks. Has there been any examination of which way it goes? Is it the corruption leads to boondoggles, or boondoggles breed corruption?
That's a great question. We're coming up with so many things that we will all have to go look into later.
Okay.
My assignment list from this is like 12 long.
In the back.
Is there a good website that tracks what happens to the Hilton in Baltimore or the Solar City in Buffalo and stuff like that?
Yeah, the best thing to do is to go on Good Jobs First. They're a great organization. They have a giant subsidy tracker where you can enter in both locations and parent companies and see everything they've got. And it goes back to about the 90s.
Okay, the last person in that row who hasn't asked a question yet. Don't forget name and affiliation if you have one.
Hi, Enrique Fernandez with the Center for American Progress. Two questions related to Puerto Rico and the tax boondoggles. One, have you looked into what happened with the demise, the phasing out of Section 936 of the IRS code? that related to Puerto Rico. And the second one, have you looked at what's happening with the Bitcoin millionaires? They call themselves Puerto Payans, and they're using a Puerto Rico law, it's called Law 22, to incentivize the moving of American millionaires to Puerto Rico. They don't pay taxes in Puerto Rico. There is a lot on the internet. You should read about it.
I haven't looked into that, but let me tell you what I'm going to be Googling as soon as this is over.
Yes, yes.
So I saw something about that, especially about the Bitcoin millionaires, and one of the biggest concerns is kind of their political leanings about being libertarian, and then what they use it is almost like to them. I'm not sure if they use this language, but talking about like a playground or like a sandbox to kind of figure out, like, oh, we're going to make almost like a Lord of the Rings kind of, this is the society we're going to create because they have the money and they have the law to be able to do that. And so there's a lot of outrage about that to say, you know, we have to stop these guys. And that, you know, that's, you know, one of the things that's just, again, getting the word out there and talking about it and showing people and looking what's happening and look at what we're allowing to happen and then trying to find ways of stopping that.
They have bought up about a third of all San Juan already, and they're buying up all the oceanfront properties.
Well, that's definitely not what PR needs. This fellow here in the checkered shirt.
David Sobelson, former ANC commissioner in Southwest Washington, where I tried to make developers make specific promises of community benefits to the community in exchange for our support of their development. And so what I'd like you to talk a little bit about is that idea in various parts of the country. Community benefits package, local source requirements, preferences for local residents in new housing, that sort of thing, so that people who live in the neighborhood of a development actually benefit from the development instead of the development only benefiting people from outside.
So one of the things that I've been working on here with a lot of people is on opportunity zones and trying to find ways to, you know, prevent gentrification with displacement, to prevent abuses. And one of the things that, you know, we kind of suggested is that having state and localities, because the Fed hasn't helped out in terms of the way they wrote the law, having state and localities tie, you know, they're offering tax breaks on top of the opportunity zones, and say, okay, if you're going to do that, tie it with, you know, affordable housing, tie it with local jobs, tie it with community benefit agreements, and so actually using these tax breaks as a way to try to ensure equitable economic development. So that's the kind of thing that, you know, certain advocates are trying. But the key is to try to, you know, level that up and try to get more people to actually get on board with that.
Yeah, and the problem is, as we've been talking about, there's a race to the bottom, right? So these places, the companies are almost always able to find somewhere where the city says, nah, you know what, forget it, we don't need that. And so to the extent that we can push those sort of things, it would be great, and letting more folks know about this sort of stuff, because until you get to a point where that's sort of general business, the company is always going to pick somewhere else where they don't have to abide by those sorts of rules.
And it gets at a concept you talk about in the book, leakage, right? Can you explain that a little bit?
So that, is when we talk about the benefits of these things, particularly around big events or big hotel chains, whatever, some non-trivial portion of that money, right, is going to wind up at corporate headquarters. So if you're talking about building a Marriott, some percentage of the money that gets spent in that Marriott is going to wind up at Marriott headquarters, not in your local community, which is a big problem. The ideal situation is to have it so that as much money as possible stays in the local community, which would lean against giving these deals to big national corporations and more to giving them to smaller local entities that are going to not just stay in the community, but participate in the community.
My name's Carl Polzer. I'm a longtime policy analyst, and I started a project called the Center on Capital and Social Equity to look at wealth concentration and how to redo capitalism in a way that's more equitable. And I guess to be provocative, my question is, you're kind of describing how capitalists create a beauty contest to locate somewhere where, it may or may not benefit the community. But there's so many things like that, like nonprofits. Elizabeth Warren recently brought up the topic of taxing wealth. And a lot of wealthy entities create nonprofits as a way of, handing off their money to favorite relatives or causes. But that money comes out of the it becomes exempt from tax. So my proposal is, if all these nonprofits that are doing policy in Washington, they all kind of cancel each other out. There should be a small tax on them if they don't. No tax if you provide direct services to the poor as a nonprofit. A small wealth tax if you just talk about policy, and a bigger one if you actually lobby. So that's just my comment.
Is CAP nonprofit?
What?
So should all of you be taxed?
Me personally, at a higher rate, probably, yeah.
Well, let me jump in, because when you brought up the whole nonprofits and tax benefits and like donating to charity, this allows me to talk about the scandal yesterday on.
We made it. We got there.
Yeah. So, where you have, if you hadn't heard about it, there was a number of people who were trying to get in what's called the side door to certain universities to basically cheat their way in, and the person who ran it, William Singer, created a nonprofit charity to help underprivileged kids get into college. I'm gonna let that hold for a while. And so these people would pay money to him. Let me rephrase that. They would donate to his charity and then deduct that off their taxes. And so that goes to your point about some of these charities and nonprofits that they set up basically to abuse the system. And now one of the things about, wealth is that wealth is not taxed, which means we don't know how wealthy people are. And so, and the reason why we don't know that is because it's not reported. But you put in a wealth tax, even a tiny wealth tax, like say 0.01% or something like that, what that's going to do is make people report that so that we can understand. We know people's incomes, but we don't know their wealth. And that goes to your point too, saying that there's these companies and corporations that pay zero. And so that's because you're able to shift their income to other places. So one of the benefits of having a wealth tax, other than revenue raising, is to actually just get people to report wealth so we can see these differences, because wealth inequality is a much bigger problem than income inequality. It's something that's finally being, brought to the forefront.
Yeah, I'll add just on the subject of charity and taxation. I think that it's twofold, right? Because donations to charity are not taxed, and one of the implications of that is that. But of course, you have to itemize your taxes for that to matter, right? So low-income people pay taxes on their charitable contributions. High-income people basically don't, as long as they itemize. So what that does is basically reward the charitable giving that is preferred by wealthy people in a way that we do not reward the charitable giving by lower-income people, which means that the charitable endeavors that wealthy people see as important, which are fundamentally different from the charitable endeavors that lower-income people see as important, are subsidized by the state. So yeah, I think it's a really sort of systematic problem that that rewards, that privileges wealthy people's political preferences in a way separate from these other conversations about bribes.
Can you quickly give us an example of what would it?
So to pick one example, so wealthy people like the opera and ballet a lot. Opera and ballet, I think, are both great things, but when wealthy people give to the opera and ballet, they get to write it off, but lower-income people maybe want to give to their local food pantry, right? They don't get to write that money off. So what it does is means that there's sort of a public benefit that is given to charities that are preferred by the very wealthy that is not arriving to the charities that are cared for by that are the primary concerns of lower-income people.
I think all the way in the back, on the corner.
Hi, my name's Tricia McDermott. Has anyone looked at question? I suspect the answer is going to be no, but it's another aspect of the sort of voting. But I guess, so Apple and Google are both going to be moving to Texas, are going to have things. So does that mean that in 2024, if Beto O'Rourke ran for senator again, he'd be more likely to win? Has anyone looked at that kind of stuff?
Do these companies, when they bring these jobs and oftentimes move workers there, does that influx end up changing the political demographic mix of the state?
That is an interesting question to which I do not know the answer.
I think one concern is that, a lot of these workplaces have a variety of political leanings. I mean, except here, but I found. But a lot of places, so, with a big corporation like Apple or Google, I'm not certain, because it actually makes me think of the guy, I forgot his name, James something, who wrote that letter talking about, I forget what it was, but he had different views that really shocked people. Like, oh, I thought tech people were liberal. And it's like, no, they run the gamut. So having corporations come in doesn't make it necessarily one way or the other.
I think we've got time for one, maybe two. There, with the white scarf.
Hi, I'm Ryan Alexander from Taxpayers for Common Sense. I can't let the charity thing go for a minute. First of all, the charitable deduction is unbelievably regressive and has been forever, and there's no reason why it should be there. I can say, having advocated that as somebody who depends on tax-deductible donations, did not make me popular. But the other piece of this is enforcement in the capacity of the IRS. I have been through an IRS charitable audit. I had to give them every single thing we published for 2 years. They interviewed my staff. It was thorough. They were, I was confident that they knew we were doing what we said we were doing. They don't have to do it that extensively, but more frequent enforcement would make a huge difference. And the capacity of the IRS is, really woefully under invested. And, my favorite statistic is of the 90,000 employees at the IRS, less than 3,000 are below 30. So in the context of policy, I think we also need to think of administration, I guess.
I couldn't agree more, of course. But when we're talking about the regressivity of things like the charitable deduction, because our tax rates go up as you make more income, what that means is deductions are worth more to rich people. So it's absolutely intrinsic to the entire idea of the charitable deduction that rich people will get more money. You would have to fundamentally shift that. It's not just regressive because rich people itemize, for instance. I believe it is the case that the number of employees who work for the IRS right now is the same level as it was in the 1950s.
And the population of the country, the number of taxpayers, is
somewhat
going up
larger.
a little bit. One more. One more? Well, thank you all very much for coming, and thank you all very much. Adjalori, Vanessa Williamson, Pat Garofalo. Pat, last word. If our audience found this so compelling that they want to hear more about the book, are there other events in the offing that they might be able to attend in the area?
Yes, on March 19th, I will be at eCity Books at 6:30, and on March 27th, I will be at Solid State Books at 7 o'clock. So come hang out. They're going to be fun.
And for the next 10 to 15 minutes or however long it takes, you'll be outside signing books,
I will be
right?
standing back there.
So thank you all very much.